The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Concord was the largest structure ever built by any known civilization. A massive ring station floating at the neutral point between 12 star systems. And on this particular day, it was filled with representatives from every species that had ever signed the Concord Treaties. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the central podium, her hands folded behind her back, her dark eyes scanning the enormous circular hall, where hundreds of alien delegates sat in their designated sections, each one watching her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely hidden contempt. She had served as Earth's senior representative to the Council for 11 years, and in that time, she had learned to read the mood of the chamber the way a sailor reads the sky before a storm. And right now, every instinct she had was telling her that something terrible was about to happen. The year was 2347, and humanity had been a member of the Galactic Concord for exactly 40 years, which in galactic terms was barely the blink of an eye. But in those 4 decades, humans had done more for the Alliance than most species had done in centuries. Earth's doctors had developed Synthocure 7, the universal antiviral compound that had saved billions of alien lives across 4 different species. Earth's engineers had built and maintained the beacon network, the chain of FTL relay stations that made galactic communication and navigation possible. And Earth's soldiers had bled and died on a dozen alien worlds defending colonies that were not their own. None of that seemed to matter today. High Arbiter Vokthalan of the Retheni Dominion rose from his seat at the top of the chamber, his tall insectoid body casting a long shadow across the floor, and his voice echoed through the translation systems as he spoke with the calm confidence of someone who already knew the outcome of what was about to happen. I formally introduce Resolution 7 Omega, he announced, his mandibles clicking in a way that Elena had learned was the Retheni equivalent of the smile. A motion to reclassify the human homeworld designated Earth from full member status to provisional member status, effective upon passage. A murmur rippled through the chamber, but it was not the murmur of surprise. It was the murmur of something long planned, finally being spoken aloud. Elena felt her stomach drop, but she kept her face perfectly still because she understood exactly what provisional member status meant. It meant the loss of Earth's voting rights, the removal of humanity's seat on the Security Directorate, and the stripping of all trade privileges that Earth had earned through decades of service and sacrifice. Vokthalan continued speaking, and his words cut deeper with every sentence. The human species is too young, he declared, gesturing with his 4 arms in a sweeping motion, too reckless, too genetically unstable to hold the responsibilities of full membership. Their lifespan is laughably short. Their civilizational history is a fraction of any other member species, and their emotional volatility makes them unsuitable for positions of galactic authority. He paused and looked directly at Elena with his compound eyes. Let us be honest with ourselves, he said, and now the clicking of his mandibles was unmistakable. We have allowed short-lived vermin to play at civilization for long enough. The word hit the chamber like a physical blow, and even some of the delegates who had been nodding along looked uncomfortable. But none of them spoke against it. None of them rose to object. And in that silence, Elena understood everything she needed to understand. She was given the right to respond, and she walked to the center of the chamber floor, with her back straight and her voice steady. In the last 40 years, she began, human soldiers have died defending the Korvathi border so that the Retheni Dominion could sleep safely. Human doctors have cured plagues that your own scientists could not understand. Human engineers have built the communication network that every species in this chamber uses every single day. And human diplomats have brokered 17 peace agreements that prevented wars which would have killed billions. She looked around the room, making eye contact with every ambassador she could. We gave you our medicine freely. We gave you our technology freely. We gave you our blood freely. And we asked for nothing in return, except to be treated as equals. She turned to the Veldrathi ambassador, a tall, graceful being with silver skin who sat 3 rows up, the representative of a species whose entire colony on Veldrathi Prime had been saved from extinction by a human relief fleet just 12 years ago. "Ambassador Shale," Elena said quietly, "your people are alive because of mine. Will you speak for us today?" Ambassador would not meet her eyes. She looked down at her hands and said nothing. And in that moment, Elena felt something inside her go very cold and very still. The vote was called, and one by one the 12 council members cast their decisions. The Retheni voted yes. The Korvathi voted yes. The Veldrathi voted yes without looking up. And species after species followed, until the final count stood at 9 in favor and 3 against. Only the Elari, the Drakesh, and the small Thanari delegation voted to keep humanity as a full member. It was done. The chamber was quiet, as everyone waited for the human ambassador to rage, or beg, or threaten, because that is what they expected from the emotional species they had just demoted. That is what the short-lived vermin were supposed to do. Elena did none of those things. She reached up and removed the diplomatic insignia from her collar, the small silver pin that marked her as Earth's voice among the stars. She placed it gently on the podium with a soft click that somehow echoed louder than any shout could have. "Earth acknowledges," she said, and her voice was perfectly calm. "Earth withdraws, effective immediately." Then she turned and walked out of the grand chamber without looking back. The delegates stared after her in confusion, because they had expected anger, or tears, or desperate negotiation, not 7 quiet words and an exit. And several of them actually laughed, believing this was a dramatic gesture that would be followed by a sheepish return within a few days. They did not understand what they had just done. Within 1 hour of Elena's departure, a single encrypted transmission fired from Earth's embassy on the Concord station to United Earth Command on Luna, and it contained only 2 words that had never been used before in the history of human galactic relations. Code Prometheus. Those 2 words activated a protocol that the Council did not know existed. A complete and total nullification of every treaty, every agreement, every pact, and every promise that humanity had ever made to any alien civilization. Across the galaxy, on 100 stations and colony worlds, every human diplomat received the signal at the same moment. Every human engineer stopped what they were building. Every human doctor put down their tools. Every human soldier lowered their weapon and stepped away from their post. They did not explain. They did not argue. They did not say goodbye. They simply packed their things and left. On Veldrathi Prime, a team of human terraforming engineers who had been maintaining the atmospheric processors that kept 3 agricultural continents alive, walked away from their consoles without a word, leaving their alien colleagues staring in confusion. On the Korvathi border, an entire human peacekeeping fleet powered down its patrol routes and turned towards Sol, leaving the space lanes they had protected for 30 years, completely unguarded. On medical stations across 4 systems, human doctors sealed their research, locked their formulas, and boarded transport ships home. And on the Concord station itself, Elena Vasquez boarded the last human shuttle and watched through the viewport as the massive ring station grew smaller and smaller behind her. She did not cry. She did not smile. She simply sat in silence and thought about the 40 years of service and sacrifice that had just been thrown away by species who had never once said thank you. Back in the Grand Chamber, High Arbiter Vokthalan was already celebrating, clicking his mandibles in amusement as he told his aides that the humans would come crawling back within a standard cycle, begging for readmission. He was wrong. He was so very wrong. And by the time he realized it, it would be far too late. The first week after humanity's departure was filled with laughter. On the Concord station, delegates from 9 different species made jokes about the dramatic exit of their former colleagues. And High Arbiter Vokthalan became the center of every social gathering as he repeated his favorite line about the vermin scurrying back to their hole. The Ritheni threw a celebration dinner in the Grand Chamber to mark what they called the correction of a historical error, and more than half the council attended, eating expensive food and drinking rare spirits while congratulating each other on finally putting the young species in its place. Ambassador Talvesi of the Ilari did not attend. She sat alone in her quarters, reading through every human treaty document she could find, and the more she read, the more a terrible feeling grew in her stomach. But nobody was listening to the Ilari. They were a small species with limited military power, and their vote against Resolution 7 Omega had already marked them as human sympathizers in the eyes of the Ritheni. So the laughter continued, right up until it didn't. It started in the Fringe Territories on the 8th day after Earth's withdrawal, a region of unstable border systems where 3 hostile factions had been held in check for decades by human peacekeeping patrols. And without those patrols, the border erupted overnight. The Korvathi raiders, who had spent 30 years being pushed back by human warships every time they tried to attack Concord shipping lanes, suddenly found those lanes completely undefended. And within 48 hours, they had seized 6 cargo convoys carrying food and medical supplies to outer colonies. The Concord sent a request to the Drakesh Collective to deploy their fleet as a temporary replacement. But the Drakesh refused because their ships were not designed for patrol duty, and their soldiers were not trained in the peacekeeping tactics that humans had spent decades perfecting. By the end of the 2nd week, the Fringe Territories were in chaos. Pirate attacks had increased by 400%. 3 border skirmishes had reignited into open conflict, and refugee ships were flooding toward the inner systems, carrying thousands of displaced civilians from colonies that had lost their protection overnight. But the Fringe Territories were only the beginning. On the 15th day, hospitals across 4 star systems began sending emergency reports to the Council. Their supplies of Synthicure 7 were running out. The universal antiviral compound that Earth had developed and distributed freely was the only thing keeping a recurring plague suppressed among the Veldrathi, the Fenari, and 2 other species. And without regular shipments, the disease would return. The Council ordered their own scientists to replicate the formula, but they quickly discovered that Earth had withdrawn all of its medical patents as part of Code Prometheus. The data files were gone, the research notes were gone, and the human scientists who understood the compound's complex molecular structure were gone. Rationing began immediately, but the math was simple and terrible. At current consumption rates, the remaining supply of Synthicure 7 would last less than 60 days. The Veldrathi ambassador finally broke her silence and demanded an emergency session of the Council, standing in the same chamber where she had voted to demote humanity just 2 weeks earlier. And her voice shook as she described the projections her medical teams had given her. Without Synthicure 7, she reported, we will lose approximately 200 million Veldrathi lives within 6 months. The chamber was very quiet after that. But even this was not the worst of it, because on the 21st day, the beacon network began to fail. The beacon network was the chain of FTL relay stations that made faster than light communication possible across the galaxy. Every trade route depended on it. Every military coordination system relied on it, and every emergency broadcast traveled through it, and humanity had built the entire thing. When the human engineers left, they took their encryption keys and their maintenance protocols with them, and without regular upkeep, the relay stations began dropping offline, one by one, like stars going dark. 6 major trade routes lost communication on the same day. Cargo ships that depended on beacon navigation found themselves flying blind, and 2 vessels collided in the Sarathi corridor, because they could no longer receive real-time position data from the network. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. Trade volume across the Concord dropped by 60% in a single week. Prices for basic goods tripled on outer colonies, and the galactic stock exchanges went into freefall as investors realized that the infrastructure they had taken for granted was built on human engineering that no one else fully understood. Ambassador Talvesi of the Ilari requested a private meeting with the full council and presented a report that she had spent 3 weeks preparing. And the contents of that report changed everything. "We made a mistake," she said bluntly, standing before delegates who did not want to hear what she had to say. Not just a political mistake, but a structural one. In 40 years of membership, humanity did not simply contribute to the Concord. They became its foundation. They built our communication network. They developed our primary medical defense against plague. They maintained our border security. And they did all of it so quietly and efficiently that we forgot it was them doing it. She projected the treaty documents onto the chamber's display screens. "And here is what none of you bothered to read," she continued. "Every single treaty contained intellectual property clauses that gave Earth full ownership of all technologies developed by human scientists and engineers. When they activated Code Prometheus and nullified the treaties, they legally reclaimed everything. Every patent, every formula, every encryption key, every navigational database." She paused and looked around the room. "They do not owe us anything, not a single thing. We took their contributions for granted, and then we called them vermin. And now we are learning exactly what their contributions were worth." High Arbiter Vokthalon dismissed her report as alarmist nonsense, and insisted that the Council's own engineers could rebuild the beacon network within a few months. They could not, because they did not know how. On the 28th day, the Council voted to send a formal communication to Earth, requesting the reopening of diplomatic channels. The message was carefully worded to avoid any admission of wrongdoing, and instead framed the situation as a mutual misunderstanding that could be resolved through renewed dialogue. The message was sent through every available channel, and Earth's response was nothing. Complete and total silence. No reply, no acknowledgement, not even a rejection. Earth had gone dark. Long-range sensor probes sent toward the Sol system detected automated defense platforms positioned along every approach vector. The platforms were broadcasting a simple repeating message in every known language that said, "Earth recognizes no treaties with the Galactic Concord, and unauthorized vessels will be redirected." Behind that wall of machines, deep scans showed something that made the Council's intelligence chiefs very nervous. The readings indicated massive industrial activity across the entire Sol system. Shipyards working at full capacity, mining operations on every moon and asteroid, and energy signatures that suggested the construction of something very large and very powerful. Get close enough to see what it was. High Arbiter Vokthalon received a private briefing from his military advisors that evening. And for the first time since the vote on Resolution 7 Omega, the arrogance drained from his face. "They are building a fleet," his chief intelligence officer told him. "A fleet no longer limited by the weapon restrictions and size caps that the Concord treaties imposed on them. And based on our projections of their industrial capacity, they will have more military power in 6 months than any 3 Council species combined." Vokthalon sat in silence for a long time after that briefing, and when his aide asked if he wanted to issue a statement, he said nothing at all. 3 months had passed since humanity walked away from the stars, and the galaxy was falling apart. The Galactic Concord had been built over centuries as a framework for cooperation and peace. But what nobody had wanted to admit was that for the last 4 decades, that framework had been held together by one species. The same species that 9 council members had voted to call vermin. Now the framework was crumbling, and every crack revealed another place where human hands had been quietly holding things together. The political collapse came first. Without Earth's neutral peacekeeping presence, the old rivalries between Council species resurfaced with a speed that shocked even the most cynical observers. The Korvathi hegemony had been testing boundaries since the day the human patrols left, and on the 63rd day after Earth's withdrawal, they made their move. Korvathi warships jumped into 2 unclaimed border systems and declared them sovereign Korvathi territory. And when the Council demanded their withdrawal, the Korvathi ambassador simply laughed and asked which fleet was going to make them leave. The answer was none, because the Concord's combined military had always relied on human tactical coordination and human-designed shield harmonics and the human beacon network for real-time battlefield communication. And without those things, the remaining fleets were a collection of ships that could not talk to each other, could not coordinate their movements, and could not fight as a unified force. The Drakesh Collective accused the Rutheni of engineering Earth's departure to create exactly this kind of power vacuum, and the Rutheni accused the Drakesh of secret negotiations with the Korvathi, and council sessions that had once been conducted with dignity and order devolved into shouting matches where ambassadors openly threatened each other. Ambassador Telvesi of the Iliari watched all of this with growing horror, because she could see clearly what most of the council still refused to acknowledge, that this was not a temporary crisis that would resolve itself. This was the beginning of the end of everything they had built. But the political collapse was nothing compared to the humanitarian disaster. The plague returned on Veldrathi Prime on the 71st day, exactly as the medical projections had predicted. The last supplies of Synthocure 7 ran out, and within 2 weeks, the infection rate among the Veldrathi population began climbing at a terrifying speed. The Veldrathi ambassador stood before the council, with tears streaming down her silver face, and begged someone to find a way to contact Earth. Her voice broke as she described the hospitals overflowing and the children dying from a disease that humanity had cured years ago. "We voted against them," she said, and her words echoed in the silent chamber. "I voted against them. I could not even look their ambassador in the eye. And now my people are dying because of what we did." Some of the delegates looked away in shame, but shame did not produce medicine, and the Veldrathi continued to die. On the 87th day, the council made one final desperate attempt to reach Earth. They assembled a diplomatic flotilla of 12 ships carrying ambassadors from every member species and sent them toward the Sol system under a flag of truce. The flotilla crossed into human-controlled space and was immediately surrounded by a wall of automated drones that appeared from nowhere. Hundreds of small machines that moved with perfect coordination and formed a barrier so dense that not a single ship could have passed through without being intercepted. The drones broadcast a single message on all frequencies in every known language. Earth recognizes no treaties with the Galactic Concord. Unauthorized vessels will be redirected. This is not a warning. It is a courtesy. Waited for 3 days, hoping that a human representative would come to speak with them, but no one came. The drones simply held their positions with mechanical patience, and eventually the ambassadors turned their ships around and went home with nothing. The council was running out of options, and they knew it. But while the galaxy crumbled, something very different was happening behind Earth's wall of silence. On Luna, in a command center buried deep beneath the surface, Director General Amir Okonkwo stood before a massive display screen showing the status of what humanity had named Project Reclamation. Okonkwo was a tall man with steady hands and calm eyes, a former military commander who had been elected to lead United Earth's government just 2 years before the Concord vote. And he had spent every day since Elena Vasquez's return preparing for what he knew was coming. "Show me the fleet numbers," he said to his operations chief. The screen updated, and the numbers were staggering. In 3 months of unrestricted production, Earth's shipyards had built more warships than they had produced in the previous 20 years combined. ships that were faster, stronger, and more heavily armed than anything the Concord Treaties had allowed. Because the treaties had not just regulated Earth's military, they had crippled it. The weapon yield limits and fleet size caps that the Council had imposed as conditions of membership had kept humanity fighting with one hand tied behind its back for 4 decades. And now that the ropes were cut, Earth's engineers were discovering just how far they could go. They reverse-engineered alien technologies that they had been sharing freely and improved them. They developed new power core designs that generated 3 times the energy of anything the Council species possessed. They built weapon systems that had been classified as theoretical impossibilities by Concord scientists. Something else. Something massive. A project so ambitious that it had required the resources of the entire Sol system to construct. Elena Vasquez served as Okonkwo's chief advisor now, having returned from her ambassadorial post with a cold clarity of purpose that made her invaluable. She spent her days reviewing intelligence reports and her nights staring at the stars from her office window on Luna, thinking about the friends she had left behind and the trust that had been broken. She did not hate the Council species. Hatred was too hot an emotion for what she felt. What she felt was something colder and more permanent. A deep and settled understanding that humanity could never again place its survival in the hands of people who saw them as disposable. One evening, Okonkwo found her in her office and sat down across from her. "The Iliari ambassador sent another message," he said, "through the old back channel, personal and unofficial." Elena looked up. The Iliari were different. Ambassador Talvesi had voted to keep Earth in the Concord, and she had been trying to reach Elena for weeks through a private communication channel they had established years ago during happier times. "What did she say?" Elena asked. Okonkwo handed her the decoded message, and it contained only 2 sentences. "Some of us remember. Some of us are sorry. What do you need us to do?" Elena read the message 3 times, and then sat quietly for a long moment before she typed her response, a single line that she sent back through the same channel. "Remember that when the time comes." She did not explain what she meant by that, and Talvesi did not ask, because both of them understood that the galaxy was heading toward a moment that would change everything. And when that moment arrived, it would matter very much who had stood with humanity and who had not. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. On the 92nd day after Earth's withdrawal, Iliari long-range sensors detected a massive fleet assembling in Korvathi space. Hundreds of warships gathering in formation near the border of Iliari territory. And the Korvathi were not being subtle about their intentions. The Iliari were a peaceful species with a small defense force. They had never needed a large military, because they had always been protected by the Concord's collective security guarantee. The same guarantee that was supposed to mean that an attack on one member was an attack on all. Talvesi realized with sickening certainty that help was not coming. The Concord she had believed in, the alliance she had defended, the institution she had served her entire life, did not have the will or the ability to protect her people. And somewhere in the silence between the stars, Earth was watching. The Korvathi invasion began at dawn on the 153rd day after humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Concord. And it began with a brutality that left no room for doubt about their intentions. 300 Korvathi warships jumped simultaneously into 3 Iliari star systems, their weapons already firing before their engines had finished cycling, and the small Iliari defense fleet that scrambled to meet them was outnumbered 10-1. The Battle of Shora Reach lasted less than 6 hours, and it was a massacre. Iliari ships fought with desperate courage, but they were civilian vessels hastily fitted with weapons and crewed by scientists and teachers who had never trained for war. And the Korvathi tore through them like a blade through paper. 72 Iliari ships were destroyed in the first engagement, their wreckage spreading across the void in a silent field of twisted metal and frozen atmosphere. And the Korvathi fleet did not even slow down as it pushed deeper into Iliari space. Ambassador Talvesi sent one final desperate plea to the Concord Council, her transmission crackling with interference as Korvathi jamming systems flooded the communication bands. "They are killing us," she said, and her voice carried the weight of a civilization watching its end approach. "They are burning our colonies, and our people are dying. We are calling on every member of this council to honor the mutual defense pact that we all signed. Please, if any of you can hear this, help us." The council heard, and the council responded with exactly what Talvesi had feared. They debated. High Arbiter Vokthalin argued that military intervention would be premature without a full strategic assessment. Other delegates worried that engaging the Korvathi could escalate the conflict beyond the Iliari systems. And the Veldrothi ambassador, who was dealing with her own plague crisis, simply did not have the resources to offer. A combined Concord fleet was eventually assembled from the ships of 4 member species. But without the human beacon network for real-time communication, the fleet could not coordinate its movements. Ships from different species used different tactical protocols and spoke different military languages. And when they finally engaged the Korvathi at the Second Battle of Shora Reach, the result was a disorganized catastrophe. The Concord fleet lost 47 ships in an engagement that should have been winnable. Their formations fell apart within minutes because they could not share targeting data fast enough. And the Korvathi, who had studied Earth's tactics for decades, knew exactly how to exploit the gaps that humanity's absence had created. The Korvathi pushed forward and reached the Ilari homeworld. On the Concord station, Vokthalon sat alone in his chambers and read the intelligence reports with hands that trembled for the first time in his very long career. The Korvathi were not just conquering Iliari's space. They were sending a message to every species in the galaxy that the Concord was powerless, that the old order was dead, and that the strong would now take what they wanted from the weak. His advisors urged him to draft a formal appeal to Earth, and after 5 days of bitter debate, the Council produced a message that was remarkable in its cowardice. It acknowledged the changed circumstances of galactic affairs, and expressed the Council's interest in renewed dialogue, without once using the words apology or mistake or wrong. The message was sent to Earth through every available channel, and for the first time in 5 months, Earth responded, but not to the Council. Director General Amir Okonkwo's voice came through on all frequencies. Every open channel in the galaxy broadcast simultaneously to every station and ship and colony world with enough power to receive a signal. Billions of ears at the same moment. 40 years ago, he said, and his voice was calm and steady, and carried the weight of a species that had made its decision. Humanity came to the stars with open hands. We shared our medicine and our technology and our soldiers and our blood. We were told we were partners. We were told we were equals, and when we were no longer useful as servants, we were told we were vermin. He paused, and across the galaxy, entire worlds held their breath. We did not come to the Concord because we needed you. We came because we believed in something greater than ourselves. You taught us that belief was misplaced. In the grand chamber of the Concord station, delegates listened in silence, some with shame on their faces, others with fear. But Earth does not abandon the innocent to pay for the sins of the arrogant. The Iliari stood with us when no one else would. They voted against our humiliation. They spoke truth when the rest of you chose silence, and they will not stand alone today. In Illyri space, where the Korvathi fleet was closing on the homeworld, every sensor on every ship suddenly detected an energy signature unlike anything any of them had ever recorded. Space itself seemed to tear open as a massive structure activated. A ring of light, large enough to swallow a moon. a warp conduit that humanity had built in secret during their months of silence, a gate that connected Sol directly to Illyri space, across a distance that should have taken weeks to cross. And through that gate came the United Earth Expeditionary Fleet. 400 warships poured through the Sol Gate in perfect formation, and they were nothing like the ships that humanity had operated under Concord restrictions. These were vessels designed without limitations, built by engineers who had spent 5 months unleashing every capability that the Treaties had suppressed. They were larger and faster, and carried weapon systems unmatched by any previous fleet. Systems that made the Korvathi targeting computers display error messages because the energy readings exceeded their maximum parameters. The Korvathi fleet commander, a veteran of 30 years of border skirmishes, looked at the sensor data and understood immediately that he had made a terrible miscalculation. He had planned his invasion based on the assumption that Earth would never return, and now 400 human warships were between his fleet and the Illyri homeworld. He ordered his ships into battle formation because the Korvathi were warriors and they did not flee, and for a brief moment the two fleets faced each other across a gap of empty space that seemed to vibrate with the tension of what was about to happen. The battle lasted 14 hours, and it was not a battle in any traditional sense of the word. It was a demonstration. Earth's ships moved with a coordination that the Korvathi could not match. Every human vessel knew exactly where every other human vessel was at all times. They shared targeting data instantaneously through systems that made the old beacon network look primitive, and they struck with a precision that was almost surgical. One by one, the Korvathi warships were disabled. Not destroyed, but disabled. Their weapons neutralized, and their engines shut down by focused electromagnetic pulses that left the ships intact but powerless. And as each vessel went dark, human boarding teams docked with the crippled ships and evacuated the crews to safety. The Korvathi commander watched in disbelief as his entire invasion fleet was taken apart piece by piece without a single ship being destroyed, because Earth was making a point that was far more terrifying than simple destruction. They were showing the galaxy that they could have killed every Korvathi soldier in the fleet, and they chose not to. They were showing the galaxy what real power looked like, and real power did not need to kill to prove itself. By the 14th hour, every Korvathi warship was either disabled or had surrendered, and the invasion that had threatened to end the Illyri civilization was over. The Korvathi hegemony transmitted its surrender not to the Concord Council, but to Earth directly, because even the Korvathi understood that the Concord no longer mattered. The real power in the galaxy had just announced its return in a way that could not be ignored. In the aftermath, as human medical ships moved through the Illyri systems, treating the wounded and delivering supplies to damaged colonies, Elena Vasquez stepped off a shuttle onto the surface of Illyri Prime. The capital city showed the scars of orbital bombardment, buildings cracked, and streets littered with debris. But the people were alive, because Earth had come when no one else would. Ambassador Talvesi met Elena at the landing site, and the Illyri diplomat who had always carried herself with quiet dignity broke down completely, tears streaming down her face as the weight of everything that had happened in the last 5 months finally overwhelmed her. Elena held her, and they stood together in the ruins of a city that had almost been lost. "I told you to remember," Elena whispered. "You did." Talvesi pulled back and looked at Elena with eyes full of gratitude and grief, and something that looked like hope. "What happens now?" she asked. Elena looked up at the sky, where human warships held their positions in silent orbit. 400 ships that represented everything humanity had built during its months of silence. 3 weeks after the Battle of Illyri space, the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Concord was full again, every seat occupied by delegates and advisors and military officials from all 12 member species. But the energy in the room was completely different from the last time humanity had stood at its center. 5 months ago, Elena Vasquez had stood at the podium as a petitioner, a representative of a species asking to be treated as equals, and the council had looked down at her with contempt. Today, Director General Amir Okonkwo walked into the chamber, and every being in the room rose to their feet, not because protocol demanded it, but because the man approaching the podium represented a civilization that had just done in 14 hours what the entire Concord could not accomplish in 2 months. Okonkwo wore no military uniform and carried no weapons. He wore a simple dark suit and walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove. And that calm simplicity was more intimidating than any show of force could have been. He reached the podium and looked up at the circular chamber, taking his time to study the faces of every ambassador present, and the silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. High Arbiter Vokthalon was the first to speak, and his voice had none of the arrogance that had filled it 5 months earlier. It was careful and measured and almost respectful. Director General Okonkwo, he said, the Council welcomes Earth's return and looks forward to reconciling our differences so that we may move forward together as partners once again. Okonkwo let the words hang in the air for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a small data device which he placed on the podium. Before we discuss the future, he said, I want everyone in this chamber to understand the past. He activated the device, and the chamber's display screens lit up with data, numbers, and names and dates scrolling across every surface, and what the data showed was the complete record of everything humanity had given to the Galactic Concord in 40 years of membership. Every human soldier who had died defending an alien world had their name displayed, 7,412 names in total. Every medical breakthrough that Earth had shared freely was listed, with the number of alien lives it had saved. Every engineering project completed, every trade route protected, every refugee sheltered, every plague cured. The numbers were staggering, and the chamber watched in silence as the full weight of humanity's contribution was laid bare for the first time. Because no one had ever bothered to add it all up before. No one had ever wanted to see the total cost of what they had been given for free. Then Okonkwo played a recording, and the voice of High Arbiter Vokthalon filled the chamber, speaking the words he had said 5 months ago. Be honest with ourselves. We have allowed short-lived vermin to play at civilization for long enough. The recording ended, and Okonkwo let the silence that followed stretch until it hurt. Vokthalon's mandibles twitched, but he did not speak, because what could he possibly say? The entire galaxy had just heard his words played back to him in a room full of people who now knew exactly what those words had cost. 7,412 humans died for this alliance, Okonkwo said, and his voice was not angry. It was something worse than angry. It was disappointed. They died defending worlds that were not their own, protecting people who were not their people, and their reward was to be called vermin by the very species they had sacrificed everything to protect. He looked directly at Vokthalon. I did not come here to rejoin the Concord, Okonkwo said. The Concord as it existed is finished. It failed because it was built on the assumption that gratitude was optional, and that the powerful could discard the useful whenever they chose. And humanity will never again submit to an institution built on that foundation. A murmur ran through the chamber, delegates exchanging worried glances, because they had expected Earth to negotiate for readmission. They had expected demands for better terms within the existing framework. They had not expected this. Instead, Okonkwo continued, we are proposing something new. He activated a second file on his data device, and the screens displayed a document that would become the most important political text in galactic history. The Terran Accords, he announced, a complete restructuring of interstellar governance. The key provisions appeared on screen, and Okonkwo explained each one with the clarity and patience of a teacher who wanted to make absolutely sure his students understood. The Galactic Concord would be dissolved and replaced by a new body called Interstellar Compact, with a charter that emphasized mutual accountability and transparent governance. No more backroom deals, no more votes of convenience, no more treating member species as disposable. No species could be reclassified or demoted without unanimous consent from every member, and a public review period lasting no fewer than 5 standard years. Never again would a civilization's status be stripped away in a single afternoon vote. Earth would retain independent military sovereignty, meaning humanity would cooperate with the Compact's defense initiatives, but would never again place its military under the command of a body that could strip its rights. Earth's fleet would defend the innocent, but it would answer only to Earth. A new Office of Accountability would be established to audit every member species' contributions to the Compact, ensuring that no single civilization could be exploited or taken for granted the way humanity had been. Would be recorded, every contribution acknowledged, every debt remembered. And then Okonkwo announced the provision that surprised everyone. The Korvathi hegemony will be admitted to the Interstellar Compact as a provisional member under strict oversight, he said. The chamber erupted in protest, delegates shouting that the Korvathi had just invaded an allied world, that they were aggressors who deserved punishment, not membership. But Okonkwo raised his hand and waited for silence. The Korvathi attacked because the alt system created the conditions for war, he said. Isolation breeds hostility, exclusion breeds resentment, and we have all just learned what happens when you push a civilization to the margins and expect them to accept it quietly. Earth will not make the same mistake that was made against us. The chamber was quiet after that, because everyone in the room understood exactly what he was saying. He was telling them that Earth had learned from what had been done to humanity, and instead of repeating the cycle of exclusion, they were choosing to break it. Then Okonkwo turned back to Vokthalon for the final provision. High Arbiter Vokthalon will be permanently barred from holding any interstellar office, he said, and his tone carried no malice. This is not punishment. It is a reminder that words have consequences, and the individual who called an entire species vermin is not fit to represent anyone on the galactic stage. Vokthalon's compound eyes went wide, and for a moment it seemed like he might protest. But then he looked around the chamber at the faces of delegates who had once laughed at his jokes about human vermin, and saw nothing but cold agreement. He said nothing. The vote on the Terran Accords was called, and one by one the delegations cast their decisions. The Eliari voted yes immediately. The Veldrathi voted yes, with tears on the ambassador's face. The Drakesh voted yes, and species after species followed, until the count stood at 11 in favor. Only the Ritheni Dominion voted against. Okonkwo looked at the Ritheni delegation and nodded. You are welcome to leave the compact if you wish, he said simply. They did not leave, because they understood that outside the compact there was nothing. No protection, no trade, no alliance. And the galaxy had just witnessed what happened to those who stood alone against a threat they could not handle. The Terran Accords passed, the Galactic Concord was dissolved, and the Interstellar Compact was born, in the same chamber where humanity had been humiliated 5 months earlier. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy began to heal. The beacon network was restored, with Earth maintaining the primary encryption keys under a dual-lock system shared with the Ilari. Synthocure 7 shipments resumed, and the plague on Veldrathi Prime was brought under control. Trade routes reopened under the protection of joint patrols, and for the first time in months, the galaxy could breathe. 1 year later, Elena Vasquez stood on the observation deck of the newly built compact station, watching ships from a dozen species pass through the trade lanes she had once helped create. She had been appointed as Earth's first ambassador to the Interstellar Compact, a position that carried more weight and more responsibility than her old role ever had. Ambassador Talvesi of the Iliari, joined her at the viewport, and the two women who had been through so much together stood in comfortable silence, watching the lights of distant ships move against the darkness. "Do you think they have truly learned?" Talvesi asked after a while. Elena considered the question carefully. She thought about the council members who had voted against humanity without a second thought. She thought about the Veldrathi ambassador who had refused to meet her eyes. She thought about Vakthalan and his clicking mandibles and his jokes about vermin. She thought about the 7,412 names on that list, the human soldiers who had died for a galaxy that had thanked them with contempt. And she thought about what humanity had built in the silence. Not just ships and weapons, but a new understanding of their place in the universe. An understanding that kindness freely given was the greatest strength any civilization could possess, and that the willingness to walk away from those who did not value it was not weakness, but wisdom. "No," Elena said finally, watching the stars, "but we have." And in every council chamber and diplomatic office and military academy across 12 civilizations, a new proverb had taken root. A saying that the Ritheni hated and everyone else had learned by heart. Do not mistake human kindness for human weakness. They are not the same thing. The galaxy would remember that lesson for a very long time.